What happens when a Hollywood legend faces a host who knows no boundaries? This moment on the Rosie O'Donnell Show became a true television legend, leaving the audience stunned and social media ablaze with discussions. Denzel Washington, a two-time Oscar winner, appeared on the show to promote his new film, a drama about the fight for justice in modern America. But no one was prepared for how quickly the friendly atmosphere would turn into a tense confrontation that revealed the deep principles of one of the most respected actors of our time. The stage was set. Bright spotlights flooded the studio of the Rosie O'Donnell Show, and the live audience buzzed with anticipation. A wave of applause rolled through the room as Denzel Washington stepped onto the stage. His signature charisma, confident stride, restrained smile, piercing gaze, instantly captivated everyone. He waved to the crowd, nodding warmly as the applause grew louder. Dressed in an elegant navy suit, he exuded the aura of a movie star while maintaining an approachable, almost casual demeanor, as if he were there to chat with friends. Rosie O'Donnell, the show's host, sat behind her desk, holding note cards. Her wide smile and energetic manner set the tone for the evening. She greeted Denzel with her characteristic humor. "Denzel, welcome. You know, I watched your new movie, and I gotta say, you look too cool for a mere mortal." The audience laughed, and Denzel responded with a subtle smile, settling into the guest chair. "Thanks, Rosie, but I'm just doing my job," he replied, his voice calm but warm. The atmosphere was light, almost festive. The co-hosts, comedian Jon Stewart, invited as a guest host, and actress Sarah Jessica Parker, who had stayed on from an earlier segment, sat nearby, smiling and adding occasional comments. Cameras hummed, capturing every moment, while producers backstage checked the show's timing. The audience, mostly female, eagerly awaited Denzel's insights about his new project. But there was a faint tension in the air, imperceptible yet palpable. Rosie started with innocent questions about the film. "Your new movie is about fighting for justice, right? You play a lawyer challenging the system. What inspired you to take on this role?" Denzel answered sincerely, speaking about the importance of stories that make people reflect on societal issues. His words were measured but passionate. "For me, this film is about how one person can make a difference if they have the courage to stand up and speak the truth. That's what I believe in." The audience applauded, and Rosie nodded, but a sly glint flashed in her eyes. She flipped through her note cards, as if preparing for the next question. And that's when the atmosphere began to shift. "Denzel, you always play these heroic characters fighting for justice," Rosie said, her voice sharpening slightly. "But let's talk about real life. You often avoid political statements, while many of your colleagues, like George Clooney or Meryl Streep, openly advocate for causes. Why are you so cautious?" The question hung in the air. The audience fell silent, sensing the conversation veering into dangerous territory. Denzel leaned forward, his brows twitching slightly, but he maintained his composure. "I don't consider myself cautious, Rosie," he replied, his voice steady but with a hint of tension. "I just believe my job is to tell stories through film. I'm not a politician. My role is to show truth through the characters I play." Rosie smiled, but it was more of a challenge than a gesture of warmth. "Oh, come on, Denzel. You're an icon. People listen to you. But you never take a clear stance. Isn't that cowardice?" She paused, letting the word linger, then added, "Or do you just want everyone to love you?" The studio froze. Jon Stewart, sitting nearby, let out a nervous laugh, trying to diffuse the tension. "Wow, Rosie, you're bringing the heat today," he said, but his joke fell flat in the silence. Sarah Jessica Parker pursed her lips, her eyes darting between Denzel and Rosie. The audience began to whisper, and a few people pulled out their phones to record the moment. Denzel slowly leaned back in his chair, his fingers lightly gripping the armrests. His face remained impassive, but a spark flickered in his eyes. "Cowardice?" he repeated softly, as if tasting the word. "Rosie, I don't think standing on a stage and telling people what to fight for is courage. Courage is doing your work, no matter what others think." The audience erupted in applause, but Rosie didn't back down. She leaned forward, her voice growing more sarcastic. But you're not just an actor, Denzel. You're a symbol. People expect more from you than just good roles. Don't you feel a responsibility to use your platform? Or are you just hiding behind your movies to avoid tough questions? The silence in the studio became oppressive. Cameras hummed, operators hurriedly adjusted angles to capture Denzel's reaction. Producers backstage exchanged panicked glances. The conversation was spiraling out of control. Jon Stewart tried to intervene again. Hey, let's get back to the movie, all right? Denzel, tell us about the filming. But Rosie cut him off, her eyes locked on her guest. I want an answer, she said, her voice insistent. Denzel, why do you shy away from responsibility? You're not just an actor, you're Denzel Washington. Denzel slowly rose from his chair. His movements were calm, but every gesture carried strength. The studio fell silent, the audience holding their breath. His eyes, deep and intense, met Rosie's. A faint tremor in his voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of decades of experience. Rosie, he said quietly, but his words cut through the air like a blade. I'm not hiding. I'm not avoiding. I live by principles that matter to me. And if you think standing here and answering your provocations makes someone strong, you're wrong. He paused, scanning the audience, who sat in complete silence. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every movement. Sarah Jessica Parker clasped her hands, her face a mix of shock and admiration. Jon Stewart looked down, unsure of what to do. Rosie, for the first time in the segment, looked flustered, her smile gone, her note cards forgotten on the desk. I came here to talk about a film that means something to me, Denzel continued, his voice growing stronger. But you decided to turn this into a circus. And you know what? I don't play those games. He turned to the audience, his gaze direct and sincere. I believe in what I do. I believe in the stories I tell. And if that's not enough for someone, he nodded slightly toward Rosie. That's their problem, not mine. The audience erupted in applause, though the tension was palpable. Some supported Denzel, others were still reeling from the unfolding events. Rosie opened her mouth to say something, but Denzel had already turned and was walking toward the exit. The click of his shoes on the studio floor was the only sound in the stunned silence. The studio of the Rosie O'Donnell show stood frozen in tense silence as Denzel Washington walked toward the exit. His measured, confident steps echoed loudly on the glossy floor, drowning out even the hum of the cameras. The audience, still holding their breath, began to whisper, and several people hurriedly pulled out their phones to capture a moment that already felt historic. Backstage, producers were in a frenzy. One frantically gestured to the camera operators to keep Denzel in frame, while another whispered into a headset, pleading with the director to cut to a commercial. But it was too late. The show had become something far greater than a mere interview. Rosie O'Donnell, still seated at her desk, snapped out of her shock. Her face, usually lit up with a broad smile, now showed a mix of confusion and indignation. She grabbed her microphone and stood, her voice trembling as she tried to regain control of the situation. Denzel, wait! She called out, her tone half pleading, half defiant. You can't just walk out. We're just talking. Denzel paused at the edge of the stage, his back still turned to Rosie. He slowly turned around, and his gaze, sharp and unrelenting, silenced the audience once more. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the intensity in his eyes, a mix of anger, frustration, and profound, unshakable dignity. Talking? He repeated, his voice low but piercing the studio like thunder. This isn't a conversation, Rosie. This is an attack. You don't want to listen, you want a show. And I'm not here to be your clown. The audience erupted in mixed reactions. Some clapped in support of Denzel, while others whispered, stunned by his sharp words. Jon Stewart, still trying to maintain an air of ease, nervously rubbed his hands and muttered something like, Well, this is an interesting turn. But his words were lost in the commotion. Sarah Jessica Parker, sitting nearby, pressed her lips together, her eyes reflecting sympathy for Denzel but too hesitant to intervene. Rosie, sensing she was losing control, took a step forward. Her face flushed, her voice growing louder. An attack? Denzel, I'm just asking the questions people want to hear. You're a star, you should be ready for this. Or do you think you can just come here, promote your movie, and not answer for your actions? Those words were like a spark in a powder keg. Denzel fully turned to face her, his presence radiating strength, but a hint of vulnerability in his voice made the entire studio hold its breath. My actions? He said, his words slow but heavy as stone. I've spent my entire life telling stories that make people think, feel, and change. I don't hide behind roles, I pour my soul into them. And you stand here accusing me of not meeting your expectations? You don't know me, Rosie. You don't know what I've been through to stand here. He paused, his gaze sweeping the audience, as if addressing each person individually. I don't owe you or anyone else an explanation. My responsibility is to stay true to myself, my family, my principles. And if you think you can humiliate me for ratings, you're gravely mistaken. The studio exploded in applause, louder than ever. Some audience members stood, cheering Denzel, while others wiped away tears, moved by his sincerity. Rosie stood clutching her microphone so tightly her knuckles turned white. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The cameras hummed, capturing every second, while producers backstage looked as if their world was crumbling. Denzel turned and walked toward the exit, this time without looking back. The click of his shoes on the studio floor was the only sound as he disappeared backstage. The door closed quietly behind him, but its sound reverberated like the final note of a symphony. The audience sat in stunned silence, divided between support for Denzel and confusion over what had just unfolded. Rosie, left alone on stage, tried to regain her composure. She forced a smile, but it looked strained. Well, that was unexpected, she said, letting out a nervous laugh. Let's go to commercial, okay? The operators hurriedly cut to a commercial break, but the moment had already gone viral. Clips of Denzel's speech began appearing on social media, and within minutes, the hashtag Denzel vs. Rosie flooded Twitter. People shared snippets of his words, debating whether he was right or if Rosie was simply doing her job. Jon Stewart and Sarah Jessica Parker exchanged awkward glances as the show went to break. Jon muttered something about how he should have stayed home, eliciting a weak laugh from a few audience members. But the atmosphere remained tense, and the producers backstage were already bracing for the media storm. The conflict between Denzel Washington and Rosie O'Donnell became one of the most talked about moments in television history. Clips of his speech garnered millions of views, and discussions on social media raged for weeks. Some accused Rosie of unethical behavior, claiming she crossed the line with personal attacks for the sake of ratings. Others defended her, arguing she was just asking tough questions that the public wanted answered. For Denzel, this moment only solidified his reputation as a man of principle. His words about staying true to oneself and one's values were quoted in articles, memes, and even sermons. Meanwhile, Rosie's career took a hit. Though her show remained popular, many began to question her approach to interviews. This story left an open question for all of us. Where is the line between a tough journalistic question and a personal attack? Did Denzel do the right thing by walking out, or should he have stayed to continue the discussion? And most importantly, does a public figure owe answers to every question thrown at them simply because they're in the spotlight? Share your thoughts in the comments, and tell us what you would have done in Denzel's place. Would you have supported his exit, or thought he was avoiding the question? Subscribe to stay updated on stories like this that make us reflect on respect, dignity, and the strength to stay true to oneself.